Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that, well, it's constantly making headlines, sparking a lot of worry.
The national debt and government deficits.
Exactly. You've heard it all, right? We're drowning in debt. Or that fear that we're burdening our children, this idea that deficit is totally out of control.
Mhm.
Why so much anxiety around this? Let's try to unpack some of that.
Well, it's understandable, I think. We often get this picture painted, that government finances are just like our own household budget, only bigger.
Right. And if we spend more than we earn at home, eventually, well, there are consequences. We know that.
Precisely.
So today our mission is to really dig into these fears, but using a lens that's, well, fascinating and sometimes really counterintuitive. Modern monetary theory, or MMT.
MFT, yeah.
We're looking at ideas from Taming the National Debt Monster with MMT, that's episode 5 of MMT Unplugged, to see if this debt monster is really as scary as it seems.
Okay.
So what's like a key starting point from MMT that challenges how we usually think about all this?
Well, what's fascinating right off the bat is MMT suggests that for governments issuing their own currency, think the U.S. dollar, the Japanese yen.
Sovereign currency issuers.
Exactly. For them, the rules of finance are fundamentally different. The government isn't necessarily constrained by needing to tax or borrow before it can spend money.
Okay, that's a big one. Let's unpack this, starting with maybe the most common fear.
Yeah.
The national debt being this huge burden we're leaving for our kids.
Ah, yes.
The source material calls this Warren Musler's innocent fraud #2, this idea that deficits today mean debt burden tomorrow.
Right. It's a very powerful image, isn't it?
Oh.
Our kids, our grandkids, having to somehow pay for what we're spending now.
Yeah.
But MMT really encourages us to make a distinction here between the financial accounting, just the numbers on a ledger, and the real resources, the real opportunities we pass on.
Right. So you mean things like the quality of the schools we build now, or the roads, the infrastructure?
Exactly. Technology we develop, the state of the environment we leave them. MMT argues that skimping on those things today, because we're afraid of a number on a spreadsheet, that could be the real burden.
So it's not like our kids will literally have to write checks to pay off bonds from decades ago.
No. The source uses this great time machine analogy. Future generations will consume what they produce in their time. They won't be sending goods and services back through time to settle our financial debts.
Okay, that makes sense. So what is the national debt, operationally speaking?
Well, simply put, it's the total sum of all the outstanding government securities. Think treasury bonds, T-bills, notes, all those things the government has issued over time.
And who holds these? Are they just floating out there?
No, they're held by various people and institutions. Individuals, banks, pension funds, mutual funds, even other countries. Essentially, these securities are like savings accounts at the Federal Reserve for whoever holds them.
Okay, savings accounts. And how do deficits connect to this? When the government spends more than it taxes.
Right, when it runs a deficit, it's injecting net financial assets, think dollars, into the private sector. That money has to go somewhere.
Ah, so the government deficit creates savings for others.
In a way, yes. It creates net financial assets for the private sector. And when the government sells bonds, it's basically offering an interest-bearing place for people or institutions to hold those dollars, those assets they just received from the government spending.
So the national debt isn't some scary void, it's NELDO. It's actually the private sector's accumulated savings of these government IOUs.
That's the MMT perspective.
Oh.
One entity's liability, the government's bond, is another entity's financial asset. They balance out.
Okay, so what happens when one of these bonds, say a 10-year Treasury note, matures? Does the Treasury suddenly need to scramble for tax dollars to pull it back?
Operationally, no. It's simpler than that. When a bond matures, it's basically an asset swap at the Federal Reserve. The Fed debits the bondholder's securities account, like taking away the expired bond voucher, and credits their bank's reserve account with the dollar amount. The form of the asset changes from an interest-bearing bond to non-interest-bearing reserves. But no future taxpayer money is needed at that specific moment for that transaction.
Just moving money between accounts at the Fed, essentially. Okay,
Yeah.
that's a very different picture.
It is.
All right, let's tackle another big one. The source calls it innocent fraud, #7, the fear that deficits today automatically mean much higher taxes tomorrow, and that this is always bad.
Yeah, this ties back to that household analogy again, doesn't it? If I max out my credit cards, I know I'll have to either earn more or cut back later.
Right, but for a government that issues its own currency.
It's different. MMT argues that the primary role of federal taxes isn't to fund government spending.
So what is the role of taxes then in this view?
It's a tool to manage the economy, specifically to manage aggregate demand and keep inflation in check. If the economy is running too hot, too much spending chasing too few goods.
Then raising taxes can cool things down, remove some spending power.
Exactly. It withdraws dollars from the private sector.
And thinking about deficits, governments often run the biggest deficits during bad economic times, right? Like recessions.
Precisely. High unemployment, businesses aren't investing, people aren't spending. That's when you tend to see larger government deficits.
Because the government steps in to fill the gap?
Yes, deficit spending can act as a crucial stabilizer. It injects demand into the economy when the private sector is pulling back. It helps support incomes, get people back to work, maybe encourage businesses to start investing again.
Okay, so follow the logic here. If today's deficit spending actually works, if it helps kickstart the economy and leads to a really strong, booming period later on, then maybe taxes might need to go up in the future, but not because we owe the money back, but to manage that successful, booming economy to prevent overheating.
That's the idea presented in the source. It uses this analogy. It's like loosening your belt after a really satisfying meal. It's not a punishment. It's a sign that you were well-nourished.
Huh. I like that. So higher taxes in a thriving economy could actually be a signal that the earlier deficit spending succeeded.
It could certainly be interpreted that way, yes. A sign of economic health requiring some moderation.
Interesting perspective. Okay, let's shift gears to another concept, innocent fraud, #3. This is the worry that government deficits take away savings from the private sector, the crowding out argument.
Right. The traditional idea is there's this fixed pool of savings out there. If the government borrows a lot by selling bonds, it competes with private businesses for those limited savings.
Driving up interest rates and making it harder for businesses to invest.
That's the conventional story.
Mm-hmm.
But MMT flips this completely on its head. It argues that federal government deficits actually add to private sector savings, dollar for dollar.
Add to savings. That sounds wrong based on everything we usually hear. How does that work?
It comes down to something called sectoral balances. It's an accounting identity, not really a theory. The source mentions it. Private sector surplus, government deficit, plus foreign surplus.
Okay, let's break that down. Private sector surplus. That's like our collective savings.
Net financial savings, yes. Households and businesses. Government deficit, we know what that is. And foreign surplus is basically the current account balance. Are we buying more from other countries than they buy from us?
Right. So these things have to balance out, like basic accounting.
Exactly. So let's simplify. Imagine trade is perfectly balanced for a moment, so the foreign surplus is zero. Then the identity just becomes private sector surplus, government deficit.
Wait, so if the government runs, say, a $100 billion deficit,
then the private sector's net financial savings must have increased by exactly $100 billion. The government's red ink is literally the private sector's black ink on the balance sheet.
how? What's the mechanism?
Well, think about how the government spends. It credits bank accounts in the private sector. It puts money into people's and businesses' accounts. That directly increases the financial assets, the savings held by the private sector.
So the deficit spending is the creation of those private savings.
From a net financial asset perspective, yes. It's the source of those net dollars for the non-government sector.
Which is the complete opposite of crowding out. It's more like crowding in savings.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And the flip side is also true, based on this accounting. If the government runs a surplus, taking in more taxes than it spends.
It must be reducing the private sector's net financial savings.
Exactly. It's withdrawing net financial assets. The source points to the Clinton surpluses in the late 90s, which were followed by a recession. MMT proponents often cite this as an example. The government surplus drained financial assets from the private sector, potentially contributing to the downturn.
Wow. Okay, that really reframes the whole deficit discussion.
It definitely does.
One last big worry people have, foreign debt holders. Specifically, you always hear about China holding a lot of U.S. debt. What happens when we have to pay back China?
Yeah, that taps into anxieties about national security, economic independence,
Definitely. So how does China end up holding U.S. Treasury bonds in the first place?
Well, primarily it's because they sell more goods and services to the U.S. than we sell to them. We have a trade deficit with China.
So they end up with a lot of U.S. dollars from those sales.
Exactly. And they need to do something with those dollars. Investing them in U.S. Treasury securities is seen as a relatively safe and liquid option. They earn some interest.
Okay. So fast forward. Those bonds mature. We have to pay China back. What actually happened? Are we sending pallets of cash or shiploads of goods?
No, not at the moment of repayment. It's, again, mostly an accounting operation at the Fed. The Fed debits China's securities account holding the treasuries.
Takes back the bond, basically.
Right. And it credits China's reserve account at the Fed with U.S. dollars.
Hmm.
So China exchanges one type of dollar asset, the treasury bond, for another type, a deposit of U.S. dollars at the Federal Reserve.
So it's still just dollars changing hands within the Fed system. No actual stuff leaves the U.S. at that point.
Not at the moment the bond is repaid, no. The real exchange of goods and services happened way back when we imported things from China, and they earned the dollars initially.
Okay. And what can China do with those dollars sitting in their Fed account?
They have a few options. They could buy more U.S. Treasury bonds. They could just hold the dollars as reserves. They could use the dollars to buy American goods or services if they want what we're selling.
Yeah.
Or they could sell those dollars on the foreign exchange market to buy euros or yen or whatever other currency they might want.
And if they sell a lot of dollars, could that affect the exchange rate?
It could, yes. Large sales could potentially push the value of the dollar down relative to other currencies, but that's an exchange rate issue. It's not the U.S. defaulting or being unable to pay.
Because, and this seems to be the recurring theme as the issuer of the U.S. dollar.
The U.S. government can always create the dollars needed to pay any obligation that is denominated in U.S. dollars.
Yeah.
It can't be forced into bankruptcy in its own currency.
That's the core MMT point about sovereign currency.
Absolutely. It's fundamental to the whole framework.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up for you, the listener. Pull together the main threads here. First, the national debt for a country like the U.S. It's not really a burden being passed to future generations in the way we usually think.
Right. It's more accurately seen as representing the private sector's accumulated savings of financial assets that originated from past government spending.
And second, higher deficits today don't automatically mean bad news bears with higher taxes tomorrow. If deficits help the economy grow strong,
then any resulting tax adjustments down the road could actually be a sign of success, a way to manage a healthy, perhaps even booming economy.
third, this idea of crowding out seems backwards from an MMT view. Government deficits actually add net financial savings to the private sector.
Dollar for dollar based on the sectoral balances accounting.
And finally, paying off debt, even to foreign countries like China, is fundamentally an internal accounting process for a sovereign currency issuer. It's about swapping one type of dollar asset for another.
The U.S. can always create the necessary dollars.
So maybe that national debt monster, it's not so monstrous after all. Maybe it's more like, I don't know, a fluffy, oversized financial poodle.
Ha, perhaps. Misunderstood. Maybe needs careful grooming and management through sensible policy.
But not inherently something set to devour our children's future.
It just requires a really different way of thinking about government finance, moving past those simple household budget analogies.
Well, this has been fascinating. And on our next deep dive, we're going to keep challenging conventional wisdom. We'll be asking, is Social Security broken?
Ooh, another big one.
And yes, we'll be looking at it through that MMT lens again, which, as you might guess by now, offers some pretty surprising, maybe even comforting perspectives.
Yeah, it's another area where understanding how a sovereign currency issuer actually operates, operationally, can lead to very different conclusions than the mainstream narrative.
Definitely something to look forward to. Until then, try not to lose sleep over those ticking debt clocks you see on the news. This has been The Deep Dive. May your assets always exceed your liabilities.
Unless, of course, you happen to be the government, creating those financial assets for the rest of us.